social, music, talk. It's really fascinating that you've worked at all these stations and all these big markets, you know, these dream markets where everyone would love to work. So let's start. You started in the late 70s at WUSF in Tampa, and you were...
University of South Florida.
Yeah.
That was the University of South Florida radio station. I actually majored in broadcasting, and I hosted the only student-run programming on a 100,000-watt NPR station that was classical and jazz. And while I was there, people in student government lobbied to get some rock and roll on the radio. And so we got 4 hours a week on Friday and Saturday nights from 11 to 1. Yeah, it was pretty ridiculous. But that wound up being my baby that I got to play with. And that's really how I learned radio, was just by doing that. And working, you know, I worked at the station running classical programs and stuff like that. But it was doing those 4 hours each week.
So you had quite a following there at the college, which is how you got hired at, I would assume that's why you got hired in 79 at WMNF in Tampa.
You know, WMNF is a community station in Tampa.
Okay.
That has just gone
right?
on the air. Well, yeah, a little bit of everything, and it's still there. WMNF.org is where you can find them. And it's, you know, block programming, public radio. They just went on the air in 79, and I reached out to them and said, hey, you know, give me a show. And so I did a weekly show there as well. Yeah, that was all volunteer. That was, but that has turned into one of the flagship, you know, independent community radio stations in the country. That was now, 30, 40 years ago now. 40 years ago.
That's amazing.
Wow.
That you've worked at all these legendary places. And then you went to WNSI in Tampa in 81 to 82.
Yeah, that was a news talk station, and I was a producer. I wound up being production director for a while. I was the assistant to the program director. I learned a whole lot there. Yeah, that station's not around anymore.
But then the big move was in 82 when you went to New York, WMCA.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I started out. I was hired to be. I actually was hired to be a weekend producer. I was down here in Florida, obviously. I told my dad I wanted to go up to New York, and he said, go check it out, see what's there. And I pounded the pavement, and I wound up getting an offer from WMCA to be a weekend producer with a promise of 10 hours a week, and I think they were paying me $8.50 an hour, which for 1982,
that was high.
You know, right? It wasn't minimum wage, you know.
Right.
So anyway, my dad said, "Don't worry, you go." I was very lucky. He said, "You go. I will help you as long as you need help. But if you don't go, you're going to always regret it." So I went, and about a month into it, the guy who was producing Bob Grant's show left, and they promoted me. And so I was Bob Grant's producer. And for those who don't know, Bob Grant was, a precursor to Rush Limbaugh. He was one of the original right-wing crazy talk show hosts in New York. And, I didn't take any guff from him. So I survived. I wound up being promoted to assistant program director. I worked there with Mario Cuomo, then the awesome governor of New York. Not a big fan of his son, but Mario was awesome. We did this Ask the Governor monthly call-in show. And actually, I was going through some old papers the other day. I just posted on Facebook. I found an old letter of recommendation he had written for me back in 1984.
Wow.
Which is pretty cool.
Yeah, he actually ran for president in 92, I guess.
Yeah, he did.
But
no, he didn't.
dropped. Oh, he didn't. But he was drafted too, and he wouldn't.
Well,
right?
he should have run. He would have won, and he would have been an amazing president.
Yeah.
But they were waiting. There was the whole story goes. There was like an airplane waiting on the tarmac for him to go make the announcement, and he, at the last minute, said, "No, I'm not doing it."
Oh well.
It's a shame.
Yeah, history changes in bizarre patterns. Mm-hmm. But okay,
yeah.
So after New York, then you actually went to another station in New York.
I went to WPLJ one day while working with Bob Grant. Bob was on vacation, and he had a then congressman, or then I think he was a former congressman at that time, guy who served just one term in Congress, who was a nut job, named John LeBoutelier. And he was guest hosting for Bob Grant. And so I was in the control room, running the board and screening calls and stuff, and the hotline rings, and I answer the phone, and it's a very deep voice, and he says, "Is John LeBoutelier available?" I said, "No, I'm sorry, he's on the air. can I give him a message? And he said, yeah, would you let him know that Jim Kerr called? Absolutely. Jim Kerr was the morning man at WPLJ, legendary New York radio personality. He was inducted into the Radio Hall of Fame last year. He's been a New York fixture since long before I went to New York, and he's doing mornings at what is it, Q105 or whatever the big classic rock station is in the city. I keep calling them Clear Channel, iHeart Media station. But anyway. So I told John, I said, so you know Jim Kerr, huh? And he said, yeah, why do are you a fan? And I said, no, but I want to work for him. Because at that time, PLJ had changed. It was New York's, best rock or whatever they were for years and years. Mm-hmm. The ABC station with the KLOS sister station in New York.
Yeah.
And known for, WPLJ, the call letters came from Frank Zappa's White Port Lemon Juice. It's a legendary station, but it had changed to Top 40 to Power 95, but I didn't care. So John LeBoutelier introduced me to Jim Kerr, who said, yes, I want you, and it took a while. We worked on Larry Berger, the program director, and eventually they hired me as really their first producer. Because back in 1984, when this was, morning shows really weren't, it was just like the start of the Morning Zoo thing. There a lot of morning shows, they didn't even ever have a producer. So I was in on that first wave of producing a big morning show. So we did battle it out with Scott Shannon at Z100, who was across the river in New Jersey, but a New York station. But we did beat them one book, which I was very proud of.
Yeah, I met Scott once when he was at Pirate in L.A. in '89. He's a cool guy.
Well,
but
I knew Scott from Tampa before he.
Oh yeah. He did mornings with Cleveland Wheeler, right?
Yep. I think at I can't even remember the station call letters, but it was a monster station in Tampa.
Right. So you knew him back then.
Yep.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So you knew him before the industry did.
I did. It's a small industry.
Yeah.
And you wind up working with people or meeting people that you cross paths with in the past.
So how did you go from WPLJ in New York, well, that's ABC, but then to KLSX in L.A.?
Well, a man. I was on vacation in Mexico, and I met a guy who lived in L.A., and we did the long-distance thing for a while and then realized that was crazy. And so I said, what the hell? And I moved out to Los Angeles and went around, pounding the pavement again, went to KLSX, which was owned by Greater Media at the time. They were doing classic rock. They had a morning show with a guy you might recognize named Phil Hendry.
Okay.
Phil Hendry, who went on to do talk with his cast of Thousand Voices and both here in Miami and at KFI in Los Angeles. But he was doing, he was classic rock jock, and so they hired me as a producer. I was with him for, I want to say about 6 months, and we just we butted heads a lot. And then I was hired across the street at KNX-FM, which was, mellow rock.
And that was,
sort of mellow
you did
rock.
Mornings there, right? Co-host?
I was hired to be the morning show co-host. Shortly after I got there, I want to say like days after I got there, we got a new general manager. And that station was owned by CBS. This was CBS Radio. Mm-hmm. So they hired a new general manager who came in from San Francisco, of all things. He was at KCBS in San Francisco before that. And I don't know what I don't know what his idea was, but it wasn't what we were doing. And he fired the morning host and brought in a guy that he used to work with named Scott Carpenter, who was an old school top 40 disc jockey. And so we get in there, and this is a mellow rock station, basically. And the first morning he looks at me and says, "So, weather mama, give us the weather." And I said, "Are you talking to me?" And he said, "Yeah, weather mama, give us the weather." And I somehow got through the show, and I walked into the new general manager's office, and I quit.
Good for you.
I can't do that. And so I gave notice. I'm like, I'm not going to just walk out on you. I'll give you here's 2 weeks notice. Well, about a week into it, I walked into his office and I said, I'm leaving, but I think you need to know what you're losing. And I basically introduced myself and told him my background, and he said, I don't want you to leave. I want you to stay. And so I stayed, and shortly after I agreed to stay, the woman who was the promotion director left. She left to go to VH1. And so they temporarily made me the director of promotion and marketing, which I did, I want to say, for about 2 years, until one day I was at Disneyland, and I ran into Mark Thompson of Mark and Brian. Now, the Mark and Brian had come on the air
1987. 87. It started,
87.
started in Birmingham in 86, and suddenly they went from market 55 or whatever to number 2. A year later in 87, they had that show till 2012.
Right. So they started in 87, right around the time, they got out to L.A. around the same time I did. So I would listen to them because they were doing something very different, really unique, really creative, and fun. And so I was a fan. And like I said, I'm at Disneyland one day, and I see Mark Thompson with his wife and baby, a little kid at the time. And I went up to him, and I introduced myself, and I said, we need to work together. And so I gave him my pitch. They had a producer, Ann something. They referred to her as Beastmaster Ann over a bit they did with Cow Pie Bingo or something. And she controlled the cows, so she was Beastmaster Ann from then on. But she had just been one of the people working in the station promotion department. She didn't really have the experience or the producer chops to take them to the next level. And so I met with Carrie Kurlop. I met with Brian, Mark and Brian. I met with the program director, Carrie Kurlop. And it took a while, but eventually they hired me as their producer. I started with them in 1990 and stayed with them until July of 94, when I moved over to KSCA.
And before you continue, that was their heyday, right? That was like early 90s through 92. They were number one morning show in Los Angeles until Howard Stern in 92.
Really?
Who came to Classics.
I didn't it was that early on. Howard Stern is an asshole. Sorry, I hope I can curse on here. But he, what he would do, he had the same MO. When he'd enter a new market, he would target the number one morning show and reposition them. And he did it with Mark and Brian. But what he said about them were complete lies. First of all, they never listened to his show. It was we just ignored him. We didn't deal with him. We didn't talk about him. We didn't listen to him. We honestly had no idea what he was doing, except when listeners would call and say, hey, this Stern guy is ragging on you. We ignored him. That was our policy.
Cool.
And I didn't listen purposely, just had nothing to do with him. But he repositioned them as, they steal his act. And, he wound up giving them a funeral, and it was a whole big thing. But he did knock them out of first place.
Yeah, that's bizarre. But then again, he was nationally syndicated with more money behind him, maybe, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
So, I don't even like Howard Stern anymore. I used to kind of like him back then, but ever since he started this Israel thing about, he's putting down Roger Waters, one of the greatest rock stars of all time, beyond being...
I don't listen. I have no idea what he says about Israel or anything else.
He's just terrible. He's just, he's defending, he's putting down Roger Waters.
A lot of people do. Roger Waters is a bit of an anti-Semite.
Well, no. That's actually. Well, he says he's not.
Well, of course he's going to say he's not, but he is. Read some of his statements.
Well, he's more like against He's against Netanyahu, right? Who's a fascist.
No, I'm against Netanyahu.
Yeah, okay.
Roger Waters, an anti-Semite, but
Well, he speaks out against Netanyahu, who's a fascist.
Okay.
That's the point. That's why Howard Stern doesn't like Roger Waters anymore. But anyway, Howard Stern is not deep. He's not deep into politics. He's more deep into female objectivity. That's why I find him repulsive.
Yeah, well, like I said, I've never listened to him. I couldn't tell you what his show was about.
Good. All right. So then we were
on against him in New York. When I was with Bob Grant, he would tussle with Bob Grant as well. He just would pick on other radio personalities, I guess, to try to win over their audiences.
Yeah, I don't like that. Social music.